Good evening, and welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. I'm Nairi Woods. I'm the founding dean of the school, and it's a huge pleasure this evening to co-host an event with the World Bank, with the IMF, and with the government of Argentina. There are many things that all of us might disagree on, but I think one thing everybody in the world would agree upon is that we would love to see a sustainable economic recovery from this period of coronavirus. And tonight, we're going to look at whether that's possible with you. I'm joined by three outstanding panelists, and we're going to ask what's different about this crisis? What is it that we know that governments should be trying to do in it? And what's going to be necessary to make that possible at the international level? Our three fantastic panelists are Geeta Gopinath, who's the chief economist at the International Monetary Fund and a professor at Harvard University, and known for her phrase, the great lockdown, to describe the conditions we're in. We have Carmen Reinhart, chief economist in the World Bank, an economist, also a professor of economics at Harvard's Kennedy School, and known for her phrase, this time is different, a book that she wrote with Ken Rogoff about 800 years of debt crises. And finally, last but certainly not least, the Minister of the Economy from Argentina, Martin Guzman, also an academic. And I think the phrase we know you by, Martin, is the one you uttered this morning when you told Argentina's creditors that this was the final offer from the Argentinian government and Argentina's future is now in its creditors' hands. So it's a huge pleasure to have the three of you as discussants on this topic tonight. And to the whole audience, I would encourage you to use the question and answer tab to fire questions at the panelists as we go through, and I'll try to make sure that you get some of those questions answered from this evening's panelists. But let me start with the question about how we frame coming out of this crisis. This crisis has all countries coming out of the crisis heavily indebted. In most, their firms are indebted, their households are indebted, the government is indebted. And yet, most economists tell us that governments should live within their means. I remember being told by an economics professor that our job was to persuade politicians that bad news was permanent and good news was temporary, because politicians love to treat a windfall gain as something that will permanently be there for them to spend, and any kind of negative shock as something temporary that was guaranteed to go away, and so the party could go on. So what kind of crisis is this one? Is this time genuinely different? Carmen Reinhart, you know, you're celebrated for this phrase. Is this crisis different? What makes it different? Should governments think about living beyond their means this time round?
Yep, it's different. That's the short. It is different, and the usual frame of reference that people, given that it's within most people's lifespan, is how does it compare to 2008, 2009? And my response is always the same. It's much worse. But let me highlight, before getting to your ultimate question, let me just highlight what some of those differences are. This crisis is not of the garden variety, if you will, of a financial excess somewhere. Sure, there's always financial excesses somewhere in the global economy, but it's driven by a pandemic of which we have little knowledge as to how long it will persist, whether there will be a second wave. So you have every letter of the alphabet, you know, V shape, U shape, you know, W's, and even L's in terms of what the recovery will look like. But the truth is, we really don't know. And so to your very germane point about treating bad shocks as permanent, very few things in life are permanent, but I grant you this one is going to be persistent. I think that, and I will get to that in a second. I also want to highlight that one of the things that makes this crisis not entirely different from previous once, but you have to go back to the 30s. It's that it's truly global. It's hit all regions. It's hit, and it continues to expand globally. It's hit every strata of income level across countries. And this has big repercussions, right? Because you also see it sort of in reinforced in the major slump in global trade, the major slump in global commodity prices, which add to the depth and the severity of the problem. And you know, I don't think we saw anything this synchronous in 2008, 2009. 2008, 2009 crisis was a financial, you know, bubble in housing in 11 advanced economies. It hit emerging markets pretty badly at the end of 2008, early 2009, but that was a swift recovery. And a big engine of growth was China. China is still also now part of that slowdown. We don't have that locomotive. Let me also just quickly conclude that this one of the things that has been the case for the fiscal stimulus, the monetary stimulus, is this is more akin to a war in that regard. And you know, when asked this question is, I'm a fiscally conservative person. You know, you ask me, what do you do? Is you try to stimulate, you try to use your fiscal and monetary instruments to the extent that you can. Because this, you know, in the midst of a war, you seldom worry about the debt buildup. You worry about that later, right? You worry about that later, but not in the middle of the war. First, you got to win the war. But I just want to highlight that there's two features of this crisis that also make it very distinct. One is crises by definition are usually sudden, but this is really, really acutely sudden. You look at country after country where these are the largest recorded declines in GDP or some of the largest increases in unemployment. And finally, it's highly regressive. It's a very regressive with informal populations, you know, unduly hit. The World Bank estimates of people shifting into below the poverty line, skyrocketing, you know, between 70 million and higher. And it's very regressive also because it impacts supply chains, and I'll stop there. It impacts supply chains. So we're seeing things like food scarcities and, you know, relative increase in food prices, in addition to the income losses, which is, of course, food is the key element for the lower income. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Carmen. Carmen, you said don't worry about the debt buildup. How long?
At the moment.
Yeah. So how long should governments not worry about the debt buildup? When should they begin to worry about the debt buildup?
When you won the war. When you won the war, meaning really this, as I highlighted, that this is, you know, and I've been saying this actually from very early this year, that, you know, the trajectory of the 1918 crisis, 1918 pandemic did not end until 1920. We hope it won't take that long, but as long as you have populations at risk, you know, you do what you can to alleviate, you know, the effects of lockdowns, the effects of the state of suspension that so many activities are in.
But then we're going to move to how you rebuild after the war. And I guess that's when we're going to see different approaches. After the Second World War, some countries, I'm sitting here in Oxford in the United Kingdom, which actually, in spite of its enormous debt and destruction of the war, entered into a huge kind of government spending program to build the health service, education, housing, infrastructure, created lots of employment, in hindsight, created lots of growth. You know, do governments stop the minute they've got the crisis under control, or should they actually, in rebuilding after this crisis, How much should governments borrow is really what I'm asking you.
Well, and I am sure we will hear this from Minister Guzman, that each country faces, I'm not skirting your question, but the budget constraints for the US with a reserve currency, which, becomes, US debt becomes particularly attractive in times of global stress. Those financial constraints are very different from the constraints that most other economies, especially emerging markets and developing economies, face. So when you also are, when it comes to an end, is going to be importantly connected to your capacity to continue or not continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Carmen. If I can move now to Geeta Gopinath. Geeta, you're chief economist in the IMF, and the IMF, if right back in the 1980s, would have seen these financial crises that it was being asked to manage with limited resources as requiring governments to stop spending and to cut back their spending. 3 decades later, there's been a lot of work done in the IMF to think about how you try to sustain demand during a crisis as well as rebuild after it. What's your view? You've come in, looked at all that research. Where does the IMF sit on this issue today?
Hi, Nairi. So this is how I see it. I mean, every crisis teaches you lessons. And I think the global financial crisis gave us a lot of food for thought. I think one of the important lessons was that if you are an economy that is functioning well below capacity, which is you're in a crisis and you're well below capacity, and you're in an environment where interest rates are very low and expected to stay low for a while, in that world, fiscal multipliers can be hugely beneficial. In fact, you could even say that in that environment, fiscal stimulus is actually the fiscally responsible thing to do. Because if you didn't do the stimulus in that environment, you would actually end up with a worse debt to GDP, mainly because the bottom falls out, which is that GDP contracts by so much. So you can actually consider the case where, yes, debt to GDP goes up because you put fiscal spending in the system, but it actually goes up by less than if you hadn't done it. So that's, I think, a lesson that we learned. But of course, the circumstances matter, which is that how much the slack is in the economy and what are interest rates doing? What do you see interest rates? So this is where Carmen's point comes in, which is that how much you can spend and for how long is also going to depend upon these factors. It's going to depend upon the trajectory for inflation. It's going to depend upon the trajectory for interest rates. And countries do differ on all those dimensions. But let me stop you if you wanted to follow up.
Yeah. So what are the fiscal measures governments, you're highlighting that actually in this crisis, governments do need to spend because the money they put into the economy is going to keep the economy going. So what are the things they should spend on? What are the things they should do, and what are the things that they shouldn't do?
Well, I think this is a crisis which is first and foremost a health crisis. So I would say the number one priority is public health and investing in public health, making sure you have the capacity to deal with the fact that the virus is still not under control, sufficient testing capacity, contact tracing, investing in treatments, vaccines. All of this is a top priority for governments. A second piece of it is, and as important, is protecting livelihoods. And this is people and also supporting firms. So this is a crisis that has led to a large number of jobs effectively being destroyed. Now, they may not show up on unemployment because of the schemes that exist at this point, but you want to make sure that people who've lost their incomes get replenished by government resources so that they can actually maintain their livelihoods, right? And especially for the most vulnerable in the population. In terms of firms, you are at a stage where firms are basically being shut down to deal with the virus. And so they will need support too, and especially small and medium enterprises. so that once you're in a recovery and things reopen, and which is what we're seeing right now, that you can see activity resuming much more quickly. Now, how exactly do these policies change once we're now in the recovery phase? And it also depends upon how long this crisis is going to last. Because so far, the approach has been to keep workers and firms matched. And there are obviously, there's a lot of sense to that. But if we're now moving into a world where we're going to see economic transformation, in the sense that some sectors are unlikely to come back in the same strength as they were before this crisis, then you will have to start encouraging a shift of workers towards sectors that are actually growing sectors and away from shrinking sectors. But given that the number one feature of this crisis is this tremendous uncertainty, everything you do has to be gradual. It is literally looking 1 or 2 months ahead and then reassessing and seeing how things evolve.
And so after the Eurozone crisis, the fund started talking about automatic stabilizers. What can you tell us about that? Like, what is it that the fund changed its view on?
Oh, indeed. We actually in April put out a paper on exactly this topic, which is on automatic stabilizers. So what exactly do you mean by that? I mean, there are the traditional automatic stabilizers which kick in when you have a progressive tax system. But the question is, how do you do what we call, for instance, a rule-based fiscal policy, right? We have rule-based monetary policy. We've had that. But how do we do rules-based fiscal policy where the amount of stimulus you're putting in is a function of macroeconomic conditions, which is the level of unemployment in the economy, the amount of slack in the economy, and so on. And it makes sense to do that because we know that otherwise there are lags between when a crisis hits, when countries decide on discretion how to put stimulus in the system, and those lags can be costly. So making it automatic so that, for instance, when we're in an environment like this, where clearly economic activity has come to a standstill and you want to provide cash transfers, so maybe what happens automatically is the generosity of the cash transfers go up. The scope of the cash transfer, in terms of the number of people it's going to cover, goes up. That has happened in a discretionary sense in this crisis, but you could think of how if this was automatically in the system, it would have been triggered much faster. And similarly, for instance, transfers from federal to state governments would also depend upon the macroeconomic conditions. So this is the sense in which being able to deliver support much more quickly would help. Now, of course, you certainly want to keep some discretion too, because not all crises are the same and you want that discretionary space. But I think we believe that there is a considerable amount that can be done to come up with kind of a rules-based fiscal policy that will help with getting economies out of recessions much faster.
Thank you. Thank you, Geeta. Let me turn now to Martin Guzman, the Minister of the Economy for Argentina. You're sitting right in the middle of this crisis. Argentina, of course, was already in crisis before coronavirus hit. And I think today probably, and yesterday, you've been sitting in negotiations, renegotiating Argentina's debt. Before we get to the debt bit though, what are the choices, what are the difficult choices that you're sitting having to make as Minister of the Economy?
Good afternoon, Nari. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be part of the discussion. Well, certainly this is, as Ms. Reinhardt pointed out, this is an unprecedented shock that happens very fast and creates unprecedented challenges. Even more for an economy that was already suffering a macroeconomic crisis. When you respond to COVID-19 with constraints that are much tighter, the challenges are of a different nature. Argentina was already in crisis from 2018. The country had experienced a sudden stop, but there were 3 currency crises in the previous 2 years to COVID-19, and we were working on resolving the macro crisis, on restructuring the debt. And basically COVID-19 acted as a shock to the way the economic system is organized. Of course, health public health is the #1 priority. That was our first premise and principle when we reacted to COVID-19. In order to contain the spread of the virus, we had to reduce circulation massively, but the economic system is prepared to work with circulation. So that created tensions that require bold, decisive policies. The way we reacted was based on the principle that the post-pandemic outcome will to a large extent depend on how we manage the pandemic on the economic front as well. We need to protect people's and firms' capabilities. We need to protect the know-how. We need to protect those that fall into a situation of high vulnerability because of the shock to the system. It will be very important to have the firms alive and to avoid destruction of formal jobs in order to ensure that the post-pandemic is a scenario of sustained economic recovery. So the way we react to that within the tight economic constraints that we had was by implementing a multi-pronged approach. Basically, we did direct transfers of cash to the population in situation of high vulnerability, subsidies of wages, as well as reduction of taxes to give better conditions to the private sector. And we also extended the unemployment insurance. These programs, in fact, have been effective to avoid increases in extreme poverty, and also to avoid massive layoffs. But again, we are also preparing the scenario for the post-pandemic. Fiscal responses will be very important. The state will have to play a very important role. So that's why it's important to have the public finances in order. And we're trying to heal the public finances now. And we are embarked in a debt restructuring process that pushes that goal.
And that's what quite a few of the audience want to hear about, how you're going to finance the program that you just set out. So Pablo Mazzoca, hi Pablo, says, how will Argentina finance its recovery? Are you relying entirely on the debt restructuring, Martin?
Well, during the pandemic, we did not have access to external finance. It will take time for Argentina to recover access to international credit markets. The debt restructuring that we're proposing also is based on the assumption that restoring confidence takes time, takes consistent macroeconomic management. So we will have to handle the post-pandemic still within tight constraints, but of course, a successful debt restructuring will help. It will help for a number of reasons. It will help us to establish a path towards stability, but also it would deepen a process that we have been following of developing of the domestic debt market and a process of normalizing the domestic capital markets in general. In a situation in which the country is resorting to central bank financing because of the constraints we face, it is important that the liquidity find assets in domestic currency where to go. So that's a critical aspects of the process we are following.
Can you give us a little glimpse of that process? You've spent days sitting on Zoom negotiating with creditors. You've made them an offer. Do you now just sit and with your fingers crossed for a month to wait for their reply? Or how does it work for those of us who are not sitting as Minister of Economy?
Very good. Yeah, of course we do more than just keeping the fingers crossed, but certainly now we made an offer and it's the time for the creditors to decide. So let me give you a bit of the whole picture of how this has worked. In December, we took office. Debt was already largely unsustainable. Argentina had lost access to credit markets completely. Country risk was at about 2,500 basis points. So it's impossible for the country to borrow at those rates. Congress allowed the executive to continue serving debt using foreign reserves for a while. Foreign reserves were and are scarce. So of course there is a limit to that and we reached that limit. We engaged with the IMF in order to assess the debt payment capacity of Argentina, and eventually we launched a formal process of negotiations. Indeed, we were hit by COVID-19 right when we were at the beginning of the negotiation process, so the whole logistics had to adapt. Of course, that has added complexity to a process that by definition is already complex. And there were some rounds of negotiations under non-disclosure agreements. We initially made an offer aligned with the outcome, the results of the debt sustainability analysis that the IMF had performed and that the government of Argentina had performed. We didn't get the acceptance of creditors. There was a number of creditors that accepted, others did not, so we continued the negotiations. At the end, we amended an offer. We presented the deal that we consider it's fair, that will help Argentina to restore debt sustainability, and at the same time, it's our view and the view of many, including of many creditors, that it will be good for the market as well. We did manage to reach an agreement with all our creditors before we launched the amended offer. So there is a large group of creditors called ad hoc that at some point the distance could not be covered, and basically we had done already our part. So we decided to launch. They will have time to decide what to do. So now the ball is on their side of the court, and it's up to them now whether to accept or not. But again, the initial reactions from a number of creditors have been positive, and we will of course continue working and explaining and trying to persuade all the stakeholders of coming on board.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What I'd like to move to is how it is that, whether it's Argentina or any other country in the system, what are the things that you absolutely need from the international institutions and from global cooperation? And perhaps I can come back to you, Carmen, in your new role. And we're all appreciating the fact that you've joined the World Bank in May, so you've probably never even stepped inside the doors of the World Bank, which must be curious. But you're already working as their chief economist. And I wonder, what's in your view, as Jo Marie Griesgraber asks in the question and answers, what's the single most important thing the World Bank can be doing to help its low income and developing countries members deal with this crisis?
So I think in varying degrees, this applies to the World Bank, this applies to the regional banks, it applies to the multilaterals, to the IMF. The first line of response has been to increase the availability of short-term financing with as few strings attached as possible, meaning you engage in what can best be called as one form or another of emergency lending. Or if in the case of, for example, the World Bank, which doesn't have a function like the IMF of supporting, so-called balance of payments crises, programs lending has been more front-loaded, meaning that, the idea is to provide more funding upfront so that the countries have the capacity to, address the emergency spending needs that are posed by the crisis. That's been the overarching line of response, increased lending in terms of volume, in terms of number of countries, and in terms of speed. The other initiative, which goes back to that one can point to, focused on the lowest income countries, is the SDDI, the debt suspension that went into effect on May 1st. The G20 proposed that bilateral creditors gave an exemption of 6 months at the time, but I think with the understanding that the longer this goes on, renewal of that timeline will have to be revisited. So that the principle is straightforward. Rather than be using very limited resources to service debt at this moment, you can redirect those to fund the emergency needs that you have. Main constraints is making sure that everybody's on board, which has not been the case. The hope was that private creditors would also join in. That hasn't happened. And there is uncertainty to what extent, which components of China's debts are also classified as, for debt reasons.
Right. So one challenge, as you say, is getting all governments to agree, getting all the G20 to agree. And the other is getting private sector creditors to agree. And
Correct.
that has always been a challenge and a real problem. And of course, in 2000, 2001, 2002, as you were working on debt restructuring, very much with your academic hat on, Carmen, the ideas of a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, thinking about whether the world should have some kind of international bankruptcy mechanism, were being debated. What's your view on that looking back? Do you think, it feels, your book tells us about how the same things just happen over and over again. And it does feel that financial crises over the last several decades have kept having this same playbook. Is it time for some kind of international bankruptcy mechanism?
Well, look, I think, there are many problems with the existing financial architecture. And I think the idea of making debt restructuring a faster, more expedient process is really going to be important for so many countries, because I think debt servicing difficulties as this crisis goes on are definitely on the rise. The story is an old one, right? I mean, the creditors want to be repaid. I mean, this was true. The first Latin American debt crisis was started in 1824. And it was London creditors, London bondholders who had bought, Latin American debt, and they wanted to be repaid, and the countries went on, and this went on for a long time. So it's always been complicated. It's always the tension. I don't need to tell the minister, the tension between the country's needs and the creditors. Right,
but the crucial difference was in the 19th century that unless you got political intervention, those bondholders always took a big hit. Sure, they wanted to be paid, but hey, they didn't get paid. I mean, they would take a hit, and the borrower would take a hit.
That's been the true post-war too. Average haircuts in the post-war have been almost 40%. A lot of the work done by Juan Cruces and Christoph Trebisch, my own work with Trebisch, haircuts were somewhat bigger in the 19th century. So you're absolutely right. They were closer to 50%. But that was also true because a lot of those episodes involved outright wars or revolutions, you had that element there. But look, the bottom line is, even with those haircuts, even with a haircut of, on average, say somewhere between 38 and 40%, historically, real rates of return on emerging market sovereign debt have been positive. Have been in excess of the international risk-free rate, even with the haircut. So, but the problem is, of course, one of from where we stand now, one of making it more expeditious process. The average post-war debt restructuring lasts 7 years. Okay, and you don't get it right the first time. It's a so the idea is to try to move in the direction to shorten that process, to you know, try to get it right the first time.
My last question is just, what is it that wealthy members need to do to equip the bank, to equip the World Bank to help its country, its borrowing countries more? What is it that you think they need to do?
Look, I think the heart of the problem of the multilaterals right now is they're not central banks. You know, that capital is limited. You know, so your ability as for the multilaterals as a whole, it's one thing to deal with an idiosyncratic crisis, one crisis somewhere, or even a regional crisis like the Asian financial crisis, or even the you know, the crisis in periphery Europe, Portugal, you know, Ireland and Greece. But when it's global, and the demands are really coming in very quickly from all sides. Gita will I'm sure, attest to the speed of at which requests come in. You know, you have institutions that are capital constrained. I think that is you know, the World Bank. One of the big questions being asked is how can it also better help the middle income countries when indeed, you know, balance sheets for these institutions are constrained. It's not like the Fed that can, you know, create facilities and support facilities and print dollars. That's not in the realm of the multilaterals.
So a bigger balance sheet. Gita, let me turn to you. Ricardo Kalaluka asks, why is the IMF clinging to debt sustainability? What should the IMF's view on debt sustainability be in these hugely exceptional times?
So just to start with, when you're thinking about lending to a country, and a country is generally, it doesn't even have to be from the IMF, but when a country is going to take on more debt, and if it is debt that's going to become just more onerous over time because the debt is unsustainable and you're just growing debt, you're just putting countries in a worse position than they would be. Now, what does it mean to become for helping these countries? Of course, that doesn't mean that you don't help these countries. What you need to do is to encourage debt to become sustainable, which is that there are credible assurances that countries will take the steps they needed to restructure the debt, because that, frankly, that is in their benefit. I mean, there will be no point in coming out of this crisis with a mountain load of debt that you're being weighed under. So debt sustainability, I mean, is just something in the benefit of the country. When we say that we have you know, that we want countries' debt to be sustainable, it's not like we're saying that we won't help you if your debt is unsustainable. We work with countries very closely, try and see how is it that one can make that debt sustainable. And there are many ways of doing that. We're not asking for countries to actually go and restructure their debts before they come to the IMF, but it's about getting the process going. And I think that is still the right thing to do. Just very quickly, in terms of what IFIs can do. So we are emergency financing, which is what's unique about this crisis, unlike the previous ones, is that, for instance, the IMF has had about 100 countries approach the IMF for emergency financing. So that is unprecedented. And we've so far, you know, processed that for about 72 countries. So, and that's at record speed. A second aspect of this crisis, which is kind of, you would think of maybe is a shoe that's still not fallen and maybe won't fall, and let's keep our fingers crossed on that, is the fact that while there is a big real crisis, at this point, there is no financial crisis. What that means is that in March, while we did see large reversals in capital flows into emerging and developing economies for about 100 billion, now we are seeing stability on capital flows. We are seeing large amounts of debt issuances by many emerging and developing economies. And so we don't have a financial crisis at this point. One of the provisions that we're also doing, one of the ways we're also supporting the global economy is through what we call our flexible credit lines and a newly created short-term liquidity line. Now, these are precautionary facilities which give countries access to IMF money in the event that they would need to trigger it. So these are like adding to their reserves that they would have. That's the sense in which making sure that there's sufficient liquidity in the international system is also very important. That's another thing we're doing. And lastly, on debt relief, absolutely. I mean, this is a time when there are countries who are having to make choices between spending on needed health services versus having to pay interest on their debt, or pay creditors. And this is certainly not the time for that. So debt service relief is hugely important. And for the debt that's, for instance, owed to the IMF, we have provided debt service relief for about 28 of our members. And we supporting, along with the World Bank, the debt services suspension initiative of the G20. I expect this more will be needed. This is not going to be it. The debt crisis, I wouldn't call this a debt crisis at this point. There could be a debt crisis, but there's certainly going to be a much more persistent need for debt relief for the poorer nations of this world.
We have a question from Boneni Mwofe from South Africa, who asks, in terms of building debt until the war is over, does it not create more problems with credit rating downgrades? Geeta, how frustrating is it to be working with countries, trying to help them in what is an exceptional crisis, and having credit rating agencies making it even more difficult?
So Nairi, I guess everybody is doing their job. I think what you do see is that for many emerging and developing economies, if anything, they're borrowing at lower rates now than they were borrowing at the start of this year. Mm-hmm. And that's a reflection of the fact that you've had interest rate cuts across the board, including in emerging and developing economies. And you've had many emerging markets for the first time actually doing quantitative easing. And so, countries that manage their macro situation well in preceding this crisis find themselves in a situation where they are still able to access markets at reasonable rates, some even lower than it was before. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that one has to completely ignore the concerns about what's happening to debt. This year, for instance, global public debt is projected to be at the highest level ever in recorded history. So we are going even past the post-World War II peaks. And this is true for emerging and developing economies, and it's true for advanced economies, right? So there is going to come a time when we are past this crisis where there will be a need to have the right policies in place on the fiscal front. And committing at this point, or at least talking or planning for medium-term fiscal consolidation also helps in terms of triggering your long-term commitment to sustainable fiscal situation. And that also helps you now in terms of borrowing at this point in time.
But we have a real global problem, don't we? We've got so many countries in desperate need of liquidity, who the ones that can raise money on capital markets are paying, about 8%. Meanwhile, we've got investors who are paying Germany, who are paying wealthy countries to hold their money for them, so that the interest rate is negative. So institutions like the IMF are born to try to resolve these collective action problems. What is it that the IMF can be doing in that context? What would you like its member states to empower it to do? Some, and indeed a number of the questions, are about the special drawing rights in the IMF. So these are, if you like, values of money that countries put in the IMF. And there's one plan that says, well, why don't you redistribute those within the IMF? Why don't you, in other words, within the membership, why don't you take the SDRs of wealthy members and give them to poorer members during this crisis? Is that kind of idea a runner? Or if not, what role can the IMF play in this world where those who really need it cannot raise liquidity, and those who don't need it are stashing it in their central banks because we're in a negative interest rate environment?
I mean, so just very quickly to the last point on whether there is clearly an argument for reallocating SDRs from those who don't need it to those that do, and we completely agree with that. And actually, that's something that we're working on full force. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that makes complete sense, and that's exactly what we are working on, and the membership is very supportive of that approach.
So what's the obstacle to it? Why is it, if the membership is supportive and it's what you want to do, just to help the audience understand, what's the obstacle to making it happen? What's stopping it from happening tomorrow?
I think this is coming together. The question is the lack of it at this point preventing us from providing the financing that we need or getting kind of money into the hands of countries? And not at this point. We have the rapid financing facility. We have concessional financing to poorer nations. But going forward, things could get worse, and we might need even more money that we can give out on a very concessional basis. And so these kinds of steps will get us there. It usually takes time for any of these, it takes some time for these changes to happen. But I would not say that at this point it's holding back essential lending that we have to do at this point. Mm-hmm. On the other question about the fact that some countries can borrow at negative rates and some countries borrow at more significant positive rates, you said negative versus 8%. What is the IMF's role here? I think the IMF's role here is to make sure that that gap is not reflective only of disorderly market conditions. I think that's one of the important things that we do, which is that there are sometimes very valid reasons where some countries are borrowing at 6% versus somebody else at 1%, inflation differentials, expected value of their currencies in the future, repayment ability, all of that comes in. One can't necessarily interfere with that because those depend also on country fundamentals. But when that gap arises, as we saw in March, because of disorderly market conditions, market panic, self-fulfilling crises, as we call it, those are the kinds of inefficiencies that we would, as an important part of the global financial safety net, that we want to prevent from happening.
And how do you do that?
So by the fact that we have $1 trillion in lending capacity, right? Because we put a floor on, at least on what countries, a max on what countries will have to pay by saying that, well, you have the IMF as a lender of last resort in a situation like this. So we can provide funding at much more reasonable rates than what the markets are providing when you have these kinds of disorderly conditions. That's one way that we can do it. The second is what I call these credit lines. The flexible credit line is exactly one of those, which countries like Mexico, Brazil, and others have signed on to, which basically gives them, it's another kind of a reserve that they have access to, if in case when they go to the markets, rates become exorbitantly high. So these are the kinds of tools. I mean, that is the main reason the IMF has $1 trillion in lending capacity. We have 250 billion already committed for these purposes, but we have about 750 billion still there.
Mm-hmm. So we can expect, in 72 countries already, bravo, that's excellent. What would you now like to see move faster? What's the number one thing you'd like to see move faster?
Well, I think in terms of, we are obviously working very closely with our membership on all fronts. This is not just about financing, but also in terms of technical capacity, policy advice, and we're working with all our membership on it. If I were to think more broadly about what kind of global effort is needed, what's the big global effort that's needed, I would say that's in ensuring that when you have effective treatments and vaccines, that it's globally available and at an affordable price to everybody in the world. And we are far from having that guaranteed at this point. And I think, but that is where I would say the biggest global effort is. It's not exactly the IMF's purview, but I think this is a very important effort that is needed.
Thank you, Geeta. Martin, let me come to you. Before you became minister, you were doing a lot of work about how global finance should be organized, debt restructuring, etc. You're now sitting in the ministers in the hot seat. What is it that you would change in the international architecture? What is it that you would change about the way international cooperation works?
Nari, for a moment, this may be part of the crisis in Argentina, for a moment I lost the connection, so I couldn't hear you well. This also explains why we need to restructure the debt, you know.
No, so I'm asking you, what is it that you would change about the international architecture now that you're sitting in the hot seat of being minister? What would be the most urgent change you would make, either to the way the IMF works, the way the World Bank works, or the way international finance itself works?
Thank you, Nari. Okay, so first, certainly debt policies in what's coming will be very important. Clearly, the uncertainty about the recovery will act as a demand shock in many countries. So we will see precautionary behavior, which will depress aggregate demand in many countries. Monetary policy will find limitations to what it can do, and fiscal policy will have to play a central role. But that's why we will need enough fiscal space, and that means that countries in situations of that distress, as Ms. Reinhardt and Ms. Hopin both stress, they will have to resolve their problems. So what we're going to see now is a test to the virtues of the market-based approach, the improvements of the contractual language over the last few years for sovereign debt, to what extent they will be effective in order to provide a solution to the debt crisis that we're going to see around the world. Argentina is now going through that. In fact, Argentina is probably the first in line, together with Ecuador, in testing how effective the system is going to be to deliver solutions to the problems we face. When it comes to us, Argentina is not trying to innovate. Argentina is just trying to resolve its own problems. What we find very important is that the progress that has been done over the last few years on the language for sovereign debt contracts is not reversed now, it's not undone. In fact, one of the issues that we face in the negotiations with our actors was that the ad hoc group asked us to remove the enhanced collective action clauses that had been endorsed by ICMA and the G20, and also had the support of IMF in 2014, which is now the market standard, is the language that Argentina is adopting. Argentina will not be the country that will innovate in any direction. But I think here there will be need for a coordinated response. The G20 and the IMF will have to play a very important role. Otherwise, there will be a lot of problems. Let me give you an idea, for instance, of the kind of situation we're facing. It's been quite complex for Argentina, and we're now trying to finally finish the debt restructuring process. And it's been complex to go through these processes when we are now not asking creditors to lose. We're just asking them to make less, but to make something that is sustainable. The principal haircut that Argentina is proposing, it's virtually zero. It's 1.9%. That's a principal haircut. So there is almost no haircut on the principal. And we're proposing a reduction of the average interest rate from 7% that Argentina could not meet in US dollars in a world of zero rates to 3.07%.
So you're putting a reasonable offer on the table. But Martin, can I take you to a slightly broader issue, because a lot of the audience have got questions for you that are of slightly broader nature. And let me just bring you to this one so that we can end this discussion coming back to each of you about rebuilding in a sustainable way. So Edward Glennie asks Martin Guzman, which sectors of Argentina's economy do you want to encourage to create jobs, and which sectors will not recover to pre-pandemic levels?
Well, certainly we are of the view that all over the world, the post-pandemic will come with structural transformations. When it comes to Argentina, and this is both valid before the pandemic and the post-pandemic, creation of knowledge, technological progress, energy, infrastructure, and logistics, they will all be at the center of the, and the state will play an active role in promoting productive policies in order to give better conditions to the private sector for creation of jobs, for improvements in productivity. Let me just say in a few seconds that, of course, there will be, the world will need a lot of creativity in the post-pandemic. We are lucky that today we have, as chief economists of the World Bank and IMF, two of the top economists in the world. That's very good for the world, but certainly creativity will be needed.
Thank you. Carmen, Vinit Sharma asks, why are Federal Reserve swap lines for dollar liquidity restricted to a few advanced nations and not for developing nations? Now, of course, the Fed has actually expanded those credit lines to 14 countries, but could they go further?
You know, the Federal Reserve was and remains the US central bank. So, you know, even when you look at international swap lines, they have been historically very sparingly used. So it is no doubt that at a time like this, it would be a very welcome move from, say, an emerging market perspective. If one of the new facilities, we've had new facilities that are buying high yield corporates, we've had new facilities that are buying US sub-sovereign debt, you know, state, local facilities buying questionable assets from the banks. It would be great if the Federal Reserve also started a facility to provide support by buying emerging market debt. But it is, I mean, it is not de facto. It is a global central bank, but de jure it is not. It is, you know, I think that, you know, the scope for having a truly a central bank, the Fed is as close to it as you get, but it is not, you know, a global central bank. It is, and I raised this issue in the context of the capital constraints of the multilaterals. Now, one thing that I would like to highlight, and because I know you're interested in the aftermath, how do you get out of this? Mm-hmm. I do think that a major factor, and this is, I think, very important across, you know, across regions. US interest rates are likely to stay very low for very long, which in turn facilitates the capacity of central banks around the globe in emerging markets to also engage in much more expansive monetary policy than thought possible even a year ago, okay? It also helps on the debt servicing side. And so I think part of the road forward is going to involve very low rates for very long. However, having said that, I think I take a less benign view that emerging markets are borrowing or able to borrow now. I think right now, those very low rates are also a fuel to the search for yield. And, you know, whether the country's fundamentals are deteriorating or not, investors will buy that debt because it is a siren song. It is, high yield at a time of zero interest rates, or as you point out, negative interest rates. And that worries me. That worries me because it can make already a pre-existing vulnerable problem much more likely to turn into a very serious problem.
Which is part of why we need international institutions. Geeta, can I come to you? This crisis has shone a very harsh spotlight on some searing inequality in countries across the world. Not, I might add, in Kerala, where you were born, which does better than most, but across so much of the world, it's shone a light on inequalities which have worsened over the last decade. What is it that we must do as we rebuild economies to ensure that we don't keep deepening that problem? Every financial crisis since the 1980s seems to result in policies which the poorest in each country bear the brunt of. So what is it that we need to do differently this time?
I think this crisis has made very clear that countries need strong social safety nets, universal healthcare, access to opportunities through training programs. I mean, this is been flagged before, but this crisis will make that even more urgent in multiple ways. One, for the fact that the people who are being most affected by this crisis are low-income households, women and minorities in many cases, and projected inequality in income is going up. Poverty rates have been coming down now for the first time in 20 years is projected to increase significantly. So I think it's quite clear that even in dealing with this crisis, countries that had better safety nets in place were able to help their people much faster and much quicker. And to coming out of this crisis, countries will need to invest in their healthcare, ensure it's accessible to everybody, invest in social safety nets. They will need to invest in making sure education is accessible to everybody. This crisis has been terrible for kids who do not live in homes with internet access or are in countries where teaching can be done online. And these will have to be a priority going forward. And in terms of other priorities, I would say, given that we would like to see a job-rich recovery coming out of this crisis, I mean, one sector which does deliver on jobs is construction infrastructure. And if we can see countries investing in that space and also at the same time pivoting towards green investment in that space, that will help bring about a job-rich recovery, which is also good for the planet. And as we know, this is not going to be the last natural disaster that we've seen. And the risks and the dangers of having climate disasters are just something that we just can't afford to neglect at this point. And so investment on that front. Another area which this crisis has pointed to is digital infrastructure. And countries that had much stronger digital infrastructures, had industries that were more digital based, have done much better than countries that don't. And clearly, we need a lot more investment internationally on this front. So we have to make sure the countries aren't left behind because they have weaker digital infrastructures. That investment will be needed. And for that, the international community will have to play a role.
So that's a fantastic agenda. But how does that play out in countries that are now so indebted, facing different kinds of debt crises, needing to meet their debt sustainability criteria? How is it that the fund can take those fabulous goals and actually help countries achieve them at this moment?
So countries are, what you said is right, countries are going to differ in their capacity to do these kinds of needed investment. Now, there are some countries that came into this crisis already with unsustainable debt levels. We have about 40% of low-income countries that are already designated as being in debt distress or high risk of being in debt distress. And that number is just growing now, and there are even emerging markets now in that situation. I think you could very well see a point in the future where there will be need for debt restructuring in many countries. And, you know, that will have to play itself out. That will be needed. And then there is, of course, also going to be the need for being able to garner more revenues. We know this again varies across countries, but in some countries, more progressivity in the tax system will be called for. A solidarity tax, what we call the solidarity tax, which is a temporary tax on very high income people, might be needed in some countries. There are obviously many issues with, you know, I would call it, I guess, tax, you know, in some cases tax evasion, in some cases tax shifting that we have around the world that will need to be addressed. So there are these other unfinished agendas that also will have to be done. On the expenditure side, you can see countries that might need to repurpose the spending. So for instance, there are countries in which energy subsidies are provided. They tend to be, in fact, regressive in nature. Given how low fuel prices are at this time, this would also be a time to remove the subsidies, but make sure that you're not hurting the low-income people. And there's other kinds of wasteful spending that happens in countries. So I think all aspects of this on the fiscal front will have to be dealt with. And it's not just one solution that applies to everybody. It's going to depend upon your country's specific circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Can I bring this to a close by asking each of you, what's your number one priority in your job at the moment? And Martine, that does not mean the debt restructuring, but outside of that. We know that's your number one, but outside of that. So Carmen, what's your number one priority as chief economist of the World Bank at the moment?
Recovery, thinking about, you know, what shape, what form, but, you know, there is a great deal of uncertainty of what that recovery will look like and of its timing. Mm-hmm. So if you were asking me what's a big preoccupation is recovery, and that means at the global level, it means across income strata. We're at a point that if we were not living in the 21st century, this would have been called the Depression a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. And what is it you wish you knew, or you wish we knew, to address that?
Look, the first thing I said, and I think everyone recognizes, it started as a health crisis. Mm-hmm. It remains a health crisis. Mm-hmm. Until we get the health crisis under control, the economy will follow the path of the disease. Mm-hmm. This is not let's reinvent our way around the health crisis.
And what are you looking forward to at the end of the lockdown? What are you most looking forward to when the lockdown's lifted?
I think going out and having ice cream, just walking around and having ice cream.
Great.
It's a simple taste, but what can I say?
Gita, what's your number one priority at the moment as chief economist of the IMF?
Hi, Nairi. You know, as you said at the beginning, we call this the Great Lockdown. And we think of this as having three phases. The first phase was when countries, the first half of this year, where countries were entering the lockdown. And then there is this period we're in now. We don't have a medical solution. Countries are reopening. So this is a tentative exit from the Great Lockdown. But we could go back to stringent lockdowns. It's just so uncertain. And then we have the third phase when you truly escape the Great Lockdown, which is when you have a medical solution, and there's that. So I think of us as trying to figure out exactly what countries will need in the different phases in terms of financing, but also in terms of how they can get the best recoveries for their economies. How do you deal with this difficult period where you reopen, cases spike, you don't want to go back to the stringent lockdowns? How do you do things better? What can we learn from the experience of the last 6 months on this front? And also planning for the worst, which is that what happens if there is going to be a major financial crisis? If there's worse news on the health front and there's worse news on the economic front, we end up with a financial crisis and this what looks like fairly sanguine conditions for many countries completely gets disrupted. So we like to prepare for the worst. We hope for the best, but prepare for the worst, like we like to, like we say. So I think that's
your
I guess
priority.
not one, but many things on my plate.
And what are you looking forward to at the end of the lockdown?
Oh, I would like to travel to India and see my parents.
Ah, very good. Martin, what's your number one priority as Minister of the Economy, other than getting the debt restructured?
Well, Nari, you know, actually the number one priority goes way beyond the debt. The number one priority for us is protecting the Argentine people, working for containing the effects of the COVID-19 crisis, and working to achieve an environment of economic security that brings peace to the people of Argentina, the families in Argentina. And that's where our full focus is on right now.
And what are you looking forward to doing when you're out of lockdown?
Well, that's going to be actually, we only had 3 months in government without lockdown. So I'm sure it's going to be a much more exciting time for the Argentine people. And we very much look forward to that. We know patience will be very important. We always tell our people that we all have to take care of each other in this context of unprecedented circumstances. But we look forward to of course, the end of the pandemic and having a different agenda. The post-pandemic agenda will be very important for Argentina as well. And Argentina that also wants to actively help and responsibly help the global economy also to deal with the challenges that the pandemic and the post-pandemic will bring.
Thank you very much, Martin, Gita, and Carmen. We've covered a lot of ground today. This crisis, I think all our panelists agree, is very different. In Carmen's words, it's different, it's a war, it's synchronous, it's global. We shouldn't be worrying about debt buildup as we fight this war, and it's highly regressive. And that highly regressive element, the fact that it's playing out on the poor most deeply, is echoed by Gita and Martin. Gita focusing on the need to invest in public health, the need to protect livelihoods, to support firms, to use cash transfers, to use a progressive tax system, to rethink fiscal multipliers in the economy, and the way in which the IMF can use its power to support that, and the way in which the IMF is now thinking and debating and getting support from its members to start stretching itself, using its SDRs, using its resources to help put more liquidity into the system. And from Martin, the concern that Argentina's been in rocky economic shape, to say the least, for some time, and the urgency that this crisis, Argentina, like most countries, the crisis has shone a spotlight on a number of things that need fixing, and on inequality in countries and the need to move away from some of the solutions to the 2008 crisis and to rebuild in a sustainable way. And I think that's an ambition shared by all three of our panelists tonight. So can I conclude by thanking you for taking the time? There are few people more busy at this moment than the Argentinian Minister of the Economy amidst debt negotiations, the chief economist of the fund facing literally dozens of countries' requests for assistance, and the brand new chief economist of the World Bank, who hasn't even been able to step into her real office yet, but is already taking up the reins of helping work out how the World Bank can really help governments around the world navigate through this crisis. So thank you all for taking the time to share your thinking with us this evening. And a huge thank you to all the audience for your excellent questions, many of which we got to and some of which we didn't. We'll have to do this again some other time. But thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nari.
And thank you, Gita and Carmen. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Bye.
Thank you.
And a final little word for those of you interested in pursuing how to use evidence in public policy. I'm thrilled that we can announce that the Blavatnik School now has a wonderful online course that will enable you to do that. And I'll leave you with a slide with some information about that course. Thank you, and I hope you'll join us again soon for another Blavatnik School of Government event. And huge thanks to the IMF, the World Bank, and the government of Argentina for co-hosting this event with us this evening.